Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime. I'm Louise Byrne. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster, and I am delighted to be your MC for today. And what better time to hear from Sinn Fein in the days that polling showing the party as the most popular party on record highs at the moment. So it's going to be fascinating to hear from party president Mary Lou McDonald today. We have large numbers of you signing up to join us on this webinar. I can see you joining as I'm talking now, and it's great to welcome delegates from across higher education and business, particularly coming towards the end of what's been an extraordinarily challenging academic year. So it's great to have everybody with us this lunchtime. Just to let you know, we do have closed captioning available today. So each delegate, you can alter those captions by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen as we go along. So I am delighted to be joined today. I'm going to introduce who you'll be hearing from. Our keynote speaker is the president of Sinn Fein, Mary Lou McDonald. Introducing her will be Professor Ciarán Ó Hógartaigh, who's president of NUI Galway and chair of the Irish Universities Association. And our panelists today, Danny McCoy, CEO of Ibec, and Professor Dochartaigh, who's the Registrar and Deputy President of NUI Galway and chair of the CAO. So our panelists now, this is the technical bit, can turn their video and mute themselves, turn the video off and mute themselves now. And you'll be rejoining us in a few minutes because we're going to have opening comments now from Professor Ciarán Ó Hógartaigh, who, as I said, is president of NUI Galway and chair of the IUI.
Louise, thank you all very much. Maurive, Amranona O'Galliv, Agus Sana Hasram Venchola, Mary Lou McDonald Curve. We were just talking beforehand about the fact that our paths crossed at one stage, myself and Mary Lou. We were both in DCU back in when she was a student there in the early 2000s, and was elected from there to the European Parliament. So her first electoral success was when she was in Dublin City University, and one might think that that was the university's loss was politics gain, but you could look at it another way, in that universities and politics and politicians are both for the public good, which I think we're very keen to see as our role as universities and as the Irish Universities Association. Universities and politics serve society, and again, we see that very much as part of our role in the current context, and our paths cross in that sense of the commitment that universities and politicians such as Mary Lou McDonald have to the public good and to serving society. And then thirdly, in the context of today's webinar, particularly pleased to welcome Mary Lou McDonald, in that universities and politicians and universities and Mary Lou McDonald also look to the future and shape the future. And we're very pleased to welcome the president of Sinn Fein and the leader of Sinn Fein to our webinar series in that context, which is on the future of Ireland and the role in which universities play, and which universities look to play in both the public good, in serving society, and in shaping the future. So Tána Hasram, Mary Lou McDonald Curve Láthair, Dinne tá Suller Mar Cheanara an son of Phobal, or son of Tauki, or son of Tucky, agus Tommy Donna Hosta will sin shulling in you, agus Kerman Fear Queen Falcha Rimpi, agus occur on a swinchi of Láthair Hranona. So I'm very pleased to welcome Mary Lou McDonald, somebody who serves the public good, who serves society, and who also serves and shapes the future. Agus tá Hasram Curve Láthair. Mary Lou McDonald, thank you.
Professor Hógartaigh, would do a quick introduction for Mary Lou McDonald. Let's set the scene, because it's a timely opportunity, I think, to hear from the deputy. This week is the first anniversary of the formation of the current coalition government, but Sinn Fein was making all the headlines over the weekend, topping a number of different opinion polls. So, I mean, what better time to hear from the party leader on its vision for the higher education sector? So Deputy McDonald is a TD for Dublin Central, leader Sinn Fein from 2018, and the first woman to lead the opposition in the Dáil. She delivered a team of 37 TDs, the highest number of women elected in 2020. And the Sinn Fein leader, as As we heard, there is no stranger to the university sector, and most of us who are not academics might have attended one university, maybe two if we were lucky, but Deputy McDonald's already ahead of the rest of us, having attended 3 of Ireland's universities: Trinity College Dublin, the University of Limerick, and Dublin City University, studying English literature, European integration studies, and human resource management. And maybe in the Q&A we can tease out a little bit as to the progression between those particular subjects, but we are delighted to have her with us today, Deputy Mary Lou McDonald.
So thank you so much, Louise, for that introduction. Goramila Mahagut, Agus Gramagut Kieran Fosta, and you've set out there my academic journey. It should be said that Trinity is my first alma mater. I did a master's degree in UL, but unfortunately, Kieran, as you know, I never got to finish that PhD in DCU, but who knows? Because tracks and journeys and travel can go in both directions. I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank the Irish Universities Association for this really valuable opportunity to speak with you about the future of Ireland, and of course the future of higher education in Ireland. And I am very conscious that I address you today as the leader of the opposition, but also as the leader of a party whose firm intent is to be in government, and I would hope perhaps even to lead the next government. I want to say at the outset that I see education, I see higher education and research and innovation as being absolutely critical to shaping a better future for all of the people on our island. I've always believed in the importance and value of education, of building knowledge, of fostering academic curiosity, and I couldn't overstate those values. In fact, at one stage, my mother lamented and wondered, would I ever leave the environs of learning and academia? Because education isn't just the best way of changing the lives of individuals, it's the way that we change the world, and it is the way I believe that we will create a more equal society. Encouraging and fueling cutting-edge research and scientific endeavour is the best way to overcome so many of our challenges that face us as a global community. And I think if anyone was in doubt of this reality, then surely the development of the COVID-19 vaccines, and indeed the multitude of ways in which medical science has risen to the challenge posed by the pandemics, has put paid to any such misgivings. And at the root of that success, and all success, is independent thinking and intellectual creativity. And as we forge with fostering advancements in these areas, I think we also need to guard against any hegemony that suggests that higher education is only about scientific research, about technology, commerce, and engineering. Because of course, these areas are fundamentally important for the future, but so too are the arts and literature, philosophy and critical thinking, law, teaching, nursing, and indeed the social sciences and social research. And I think that all of these areas have to be nurtured and progressed in order to harness the full diversity of talent, of ability, of intellect that pulses right across our society. They say that it takes the village to raise the child. I think it follows that it takes a kaleidoscope of academic interests, pursuits, and disciplines to grow higher education in a way that will transform our society and our lives for the better. After a year in which a pandemic has upended everything and swept away so many of the old certainties, we're now presented with a unique opportunity and a fresh canvas on which to renew a progressive vision for higher education in Ireland. And I think it's essential that all of us grasp the vital role that higher education and research will undoubtedly play in our social and our economic recovery, and in building Ireland back better, to borrow that phrase, to boldly set out to ensure that higher education has the supports and the resources needed. to guarantee that in the coming decade, the sector truly has the reservoir of assets required to fulfill its potential to lead in world-class education, research output, and in driving innovation. So for those in leadership positions, whether in government, in politics, or in the higher education sector itself, there is now, I believe, a key question to be answered. And it's this: will we use this unprecedented opportunity to allow higher education to become an avenue through which inequality is widened, or will we use it to ensure that education realizes its full promise as the great equalizer and delivers opportunity and progress for all? And I think if we're agreed that we need to build a better society, if we're to create a stronger, fairer economy driven by innovation and knowledge, then surely our answer must be the latter. People are our greatest assets, and people are the greatest asset of the higher education sector. So the opportunity to learn and to advance, to attend third level education, must be one that affords opportunity to everyone, irrespective of your economic status. I want to acknowledge that there has been much progress in access to education over the years, but I think it's also important that we acknowledge that it hasn't been enough, that we're not there yet, because to this day, huge systemic barriers still exist for students. Far too many are still denied access to higher education, either because the horizon is not available to them, that education is perceived for others, or simply because they cannot afford the opportunity. And if we're to take my home city of Dublin as a snapshot, students from the most affluent areas are up to 14 times more likely to progress to university than their counterparts from some schools in our city's most disadvantaged areas. So I grew up in an area where attendance rates were over 90% into third level in university, but I represent a constituency, particularly in the North Inner City, where very, very few go on to third level. And I can tell you it's not for the lack of ability. It's because the odds are stacked against some. It's my experience that the brains of Ireland are in the flat complexes of Dublin and beyond. The brains of Ireland in working class communities in every county are not being tapped and utilised, because too many times the massive costs associated with going on with attending college or university sends the message to people that university, college learning, higher education is not for you. And that's not to say, by the way, I'm not advancing the argument that everybody has to go to university, that everybody has to follow a particular path of learning or third level education. The trades, vocational training, all of that is as every bit as important for those of us whose aptitudes, whose talents, and whose star guides us into those areas. But I don't think we can talk about education as the great leveler while the embedded inequalities in access to higher education still persist. We have to confront this reality, and more importantly, we have to change it. SUSI grants are the most important policy tool for increasing access to higher education for low-income families, and yet there hasn't been an increase in the rates for a decade. If SUSI is to stand any chance of mitigating socioeconomic disadvantage, it's vital that it takes into account the full spectrum of additional needs to ensure accessibility to all groups in our society. And that is why I believe that SUSI needs to be significantly expanded. Improving access to higher education and progressive positive reform of the sector go hand in hand. The HEA Bill 2021 will begin pre-legislative scrutiny in the coming weeks, and I welcome the opportunity for reform of governance in the sector. I think we have to use this opportunity to ensure that students and staff have a greater say in decision making to provide inclusive education. opportunities to deal with issues of precarious work in higher education, and vitally, to protect and to enhance academic freedom and independence. I think the new legislation is also an important time to set a vision for the sector where higher education is inclusive and is valued as a public good. However, I think it would be a mistake for us to portray governance as the most pressing or the single overriding issue for the sector, because the real and essential problem has been and remains underfunding. Indeed, the IUA has recognised that there has been a sustained period of disinvestment in higher education, with costs passed on to students and families. And we can see the result of this in the fact that we have the highest fees in the European Union. On a per student basis, we're still far below pre-crash levels. Third level institutions are given just 50% less funding per student than they were in 2008. And while private funding provides much needed revenue, the fact is the state has to step up and ensure that our higher education institutions are funded and directed for the public good. So the starvation of core and capital funding has to end. And while the government is waiting on recommendations from the EU analysis of funding options, Sinn Fein has always been clear. We are firmly committed to option one of the three options outlined in the Cassell's report. And this means, of course, a predominantly state-funded system that we believe could be delivered over the lifetime, the full lifetime and mandate of a government. Reducing fees with the end point of abolishing them and replacing those revenues and additional revenues with public funding. And of course, I know for many of you, when you mentioned the issue of fee reduction or fee abolition, the issue of core funding looms large, because let me recognise that revenue lost has to be revenue replaced and enhanced. We believe that this is the best way to shape an inclusive, supportive and sustainable environment for Ireland's higher education sector. There is, of course, a consensus that research and development is the tip of the sword in driving education, innovation and progress. However, the sad reality is that this sentiment has not been backed up with funding. Governments have spent less on R&D as a percentage of modified gross national income every year since 2011. And this leaves us below the EU average. In fact, it's incredible that successive governments have failed to grasp the importance, the full importance of R&D, when all economic reports and analysis demonstrate that for every €1 invested in R&D, more than €5 is returned to the economy. So it really is a no-brainer. We have to change things, and publicly funded research is essential to tackle the social and economic challenges that we face to produce a sustainable economy. I think the higher education sector has to be at the centre of a transformed state policy that rejects any notion that there would be purely a commercial or a neoliberal stranglehold on research, and instead that we unleash the power of research for the public good. So Sinn Fein would ramp up and rebalance research and development by increasing funding to the EU average. And we'd position research and development as the engine of economic growth and the creation of quality, high quality, sustainable jobs. I think the pandemic has taught us that we are at our best when the connections between the research community and social solidarity are strong. And I believe this will also be an essential component as we move forward in tackling the climate crisis and as we explore ways of achieving a truly just transition. And I should also say, as we move towards a point in Ireland where constitutional change and reshaping is a reality and in prospect. Connectivity between higher education and society is key. The sector can't be an island in splendid isolation. Yes, it must be internally robust and vibrant, but it also has to be outward looking and tethered to the everyday world. The American journalist Sidney Harris once said that the whole purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows. And I think this is a great metaphor to demonstrate the centrality of higher education and research for the road for Ireland that lies ahead. I think it guides us and all of our understandings. And I think it's one that not just academics, but equally people in the world of business and investment would want us to follow. We know that Irish CEOs are far more concerned with skills deficits among the workforce than their counterparts in other jurisdictions. We know that our economy has experienced persistent labour shortages in some sectors and an over-reliance on international recruitment in others. For example, last week, government acknowledged that the evidence within the healthcare sector tells us that despite increased efforts to recruit from the Irish and European labour markets, we simply we need that simply to meet demand, and we still fall short. Sector deficits have been identified, and some of the government will now seek to address through an employment and permit system. So we all agree that investment in education and training, as well as the industries identified in the critical skills review, can address the gaps in key sectors of our workforce. I don't think it'll surprise you to hear me say that I want to see deeper cooperation between third level education on the island of Ireland. The new Department of Higher Education has committed to advancing North-South cooperation in third level in its statement of strategy, and has committed to increasing cross-border cooperation, which is reiterated in the current programme for government. Similar commitments have been made by previous governments, and yet cross-border enrolment on the island remains low. We know differences in admissions, funding, and a general lack of collaboration and information between government institutions has had a limiting impact on student opportunities. To gain a deeper understanding of these barriers, Sinn Féin's Further and Higher Education spokespersons Rose Conway-Walsh and John O'Dowd, North and South, or South and North, have launched a survey to look at how we can remove these barriers to increase cross-border enrolment in third level education. And I'd look forward to sharing these proposals with you in the time ahead. So friends, I open my remarks by saying that I see higher education and research as being critical to shaping a better future for all of us. And as someone who has benefited enormously from an excellent third level education, I really want every young person and every not so young person in lifelong learning, regardless of their background, regardless of their postal address, to know that they too can have access to a higher education in the fields and in the areas and in the manner that they aspire to. As a decision maker, a legislator, and a political leader, I understand that access means investment. It means innovation, and it means interconnectedness with all sectors, both public and private, right across our island, as well as deepened relationships with our international partners. So can I finish as I started, thanking once again the Irish Universities Association for inviting me to be here with you to participate in this event. And I want to acknowledge and thank also your team for all their hard work.
Well, Gurmila Margaret, Deputy McDonald, lots in that address there. Looking forward to getting into the details of some of what you said there over the course of our discussion. So can we now introduce the rest of the panellists? You'll know them, I'm sure. Danny McCoy is the Chief Executive Officer of Ibec since 2009. Ibec is, of course, Ireland's largest business representative organisation and the country's largest lobbying group. It has 240 staff in 7 locations. And prior to joining Ibec, Danny was a senior economist at both the ESRI and the Central Bank of Ireland, and also no stranger to the third level sector He's held lecturing posts at Dublin City University, University College London, University of Oxford and Trinity College Dublin. And also joining us this lunchtime, a native of Belfast, Professor Dochartaigh is the Deputy President and Registrar of MUI Galway, and he's the current chair of the CAO board, previously Professor of German and Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ulster. So thank you to you all who have submitted questions when you were registering. You can use, there's a Q&A function there at the top of your screens if you want to add additional questions. We'll try to get to some of them. But I think probably the best place to start is brass tacks, because everyone on this webinar knows all too well the reality of the funding crisis in the sector. So Mary Lou McDonald, can I ask you there, because you've just said that the Sinn Fein proposal is to reduce fees by €500 per year, if I heard you right. If the massive cost of education, as you put it, is the key to access, why not abolish it from the start?
Because, Louise, we have to do this in a phased fashion. I mean, if I had a magic wand and I could wish fees away, I would, but sadly there is no political leader who can do that. And we're conscious that we need to do two things. On the one hand, abolish the fees, but also to ramp up investment in the sector. And I know from talking to people who work in the higher education field, that there's kind of two impulses that certainly I think are reflected in many of us in political life. On the one hand, a recognition that we have the highest level of fees, and that is an issue that causes a problem for many families, many students, and it is a push factor, and we need to abolish that. But on the other hand, you're dealing with the sector, as I set out and as colleagues on this webinar know all too well, that has been underfunded and a process of disinvestment. So you're trying to balance those two things. Our commitment is to abolish fees, but it would be done in a phased way over the lifetime of government. But it is equally our intention to up core funding, because that's at the heart of the issue, and that will be expensive. There's no cheap way to do this, Louise. This cannot be done on the fly. But I regard this as investment. I actually regard investment in education at every stage, and that includes third and fourth level, as the smartest money that we will invest. It's the smartest investment for economy, for our economy and jobs, but for our society as well, for our quality of life, for our ability to innovate, not just in science and technology, but to socially innovate as well.
But I suppose the message, though, to the children in your constituency, as you mentioned, in Dublin, who are far less likely to go to university because of those high access costs, is that they'll have to wait to the end of a term of Sinn Fein in government to have the fees fully abolished.
Well, no, I mean, firstly, to say not every student attending will be paying fees. I mentioned the need to ramp up SUSI. I could also have mentioned the issue, which again is a huge push factor and a real difficulty for many students and their families, which is the whole area of accommodation cost, accessing accommodation, the level of rents, which are absolutely crippling. I could cite Dublin, which is possibly the most extreme example of it, but that's a reality right across the state. So I'm very conscious that we need to support families in many, many ways. And the abolition of fees, I think, in that graduated way will make a real difference. But I'm a realist as well in knowing that we need to step up supports in a more universal way. And just to say this also, Louise, and I made the point in my remarks, but I think it's probably worth amplifying. The issue of cost is the most obvious barrier for lots of people in respect of higher education opportunity. But there's also the issue of a person's horizon and where you fit in and where you belong. And I think for lots of people, the best and the brightest coming from communities across the island, we have to have a sense of mission to engage. So that means engagement between whether it's some of the new technological universities, one here in Grange Gorman, and local secondary schools and primary schools and local communities and families, to make learning a welcoming place and to say to every citizen, this is for you too. And then we need to get the money right. And we need to make sure that it is a realistic proposition for a working class kid to actually spend the 3 years or the 2 years or the 4 years or the 8 years, depending on how you pursue your learning, but that is a realistic option for you. So it's a big job. It's going to cost state resources into the hundreds of millions. So I'm saying that very openly. This is a very considerable investment, but it's certainly one that we are committed to. And I only hope that we get the opportunity to make it happen.
Well, let's bring in Professor Dochartaigh there, Professor, because I mean, you've heard the deputy there. The firm intention is to lead. How do you react to what you're hearing there? And in particular, I suppose, where do you see the potential difficulties with the Sinn Fein manifesto? Let's talk specifically around fees, because even a graduated abolition of fees, that leaves you with a gap in your balance sheet, doesn't it?
Unless it's replaced with state funding. And certainly it would leave a gap with us. And in terms of increasing the state funding, let's be clear that the fees themselves, I think the minister said in the Dáil recently that removing the fees would cost something in the region of 150 million when you net off SUSI contributions and so on and so forth. That doesn't strike me as insurmountable. The bigger challenge is actually finding the additional funding, because we're one of the most underfunded sectors, frankly, in Europe and by student. And that is a significant challenge for this country in terms of delivering. The numbers of students in the third level sector have gone from 150,000 to 213,000 in the last 12 years. Staffing hasn't changed. The funding per student has been decreased very significantly. So I think the real challenge, if I'm to be frank about it, is that I don't see the replacing of the student contribution as the biggest challenge. You could argue about the merits of it, because arguably if SUSI is so prevalent and 45% of students are already getting SUSI, it's arguably those who can afford to pay the fee, who are, at least some of those who are currently paying the fee could probably afford it. But that aside, that's a straightforward political choice. There is, however, an imperative to find additional funding, and the IUA has made a submission to the effect that we need another 400 million per year in recurrent funding and 490 million one-off capital investment. And that finding that will be a real challenge for any political party, but it is essential because, and linked to it, I suppose I would make the following point. The Republic has one of the highest participation rates in third level education in the world. It's something like 63% of our school leavers go to third level education, which is 10% higher than Switzerland, 20% higher than the UK or the US, 30% higher than Germany. Countries where they have very significant, and Mary Lou talked about this, apprenticeship structures, certainly in Germany. Australia is also like it, and where they actually have a more balanced approach to the range of skills. And Mary Lou did talk about this, the range of skills that are needed in a society from the school leavers. So I suppose for me, there is the need for significant investment in higher education, but I would suggest there's also a need for a national discourse around what exactly it is, what are the opportunities that we provide for our school leavers, and is it the full range, rather than this almost default that I heard from one of my kids recently, that if you're not going to university, you're almost seen as what's wrong with you. And I think we do need a wider discussion than that. So I'd kind of welcome comments on that, but I think the funding piece is more than just the fees. It really is the significant need for very additional investment.
Well, let's put that to Deputy McDonald. You heard there from the Professor, hundreds of millions of euro of extra direct funding needed. Will a Sinn Fein government provide that funding?
Yeah, and in fact, I entirely agree with Paul. I don't think we're at odds on any of the points that you have made. I agree with you on the abolition of fees. That is a straight up political choice. And I've made our position clear on that. And I also said, Louise, if you recall, that there is that issue. And then there is the issue of core funding. And it is of the order that you have described. And we have, again, options here. We can say, well, that's a bridge too far. We're not prepared to go that route. Or we can appreciate that this is necessary investment. I mean, I'm acutely conscious that the debt on the balance sheet of our higher education organisations is now heading towards the €1 billion mark. And look, I'm not arguing against the capacity of institutions to borrow. I think that's a good aspect of your autonomy and your independence and the capacity of any institution to grow and to innovate. But there is a tipping point in that as well. And the reality is that we need state funding of that order. And yes, that is our commitment, Louise. And of course, that leads us into a wider conversation around how you raise and levy taxes and who pays what and how you pay for things. But I am absolutely of the view that for citizens, for working people, and for business, by the way, the value of an investment of this scale in higher education is, I think, obvious and I think widely supported. So it's a question then of the political will of making it happen. And there's been a bit of a game of a cat and mouse, Louise, with the Castles report. You know, people's, well, we're waiting for an evaluation. Look, I'm not against an evaluation. Of course, we need an evaluation, but we also then need a decision. And our view is that option one is the right way to go. Others may have a different view. If they have a different view, they need to state it. And then we need, as a society, to get a move on. We shouldn't be caught in a space where there's an avoidance of decision making. But I hear what you're saying, Paul, and I agree with you. Also about this idea of you don't go to university, there's something wrong with you. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with that way of thinking. Access to university is one thing, but there are many other ways, as people on this webinar will know, that we can pursue learning and progress and excellence. It's not unique to our universities, although it's there for sure.
Can we stick with funding, I suppose, because as you mentioned, that Cassell's report reckons higher education alone needs €600 million a year. Your manifesto before the last election proposed an extra 1.1 billion up to 2025 in respect of education. There's a shortfall there. So where does Sinn Fein envisage making up that shortfall between what is expected to be needed and what you've committed to in your previous manifesto? For example, can you see any circumstance where student loans could be considered to help with the shortfall?
No, I don't favour that approach. I think that approach is problematic, not least because, again, as a push factor for many people in terms of participating, I think it would be an issue. And I think there's an even wider issue for younger people in particular, who find themselves living in a gig economy where accommodation is beyond their reach and where we have really failed them. I mean, as a society and the political class have failed this generation of young people. And by that, I mean people up into their 30s. I don't want a repetition of this with the next generation coming up, who in addition to all of the above also carry student debt. And I'm speaking to you currently, Louise, as the leader of the opposition and not as a person in government or as Taoiseach. So I have to make my comments mindful of the consequences that might flow if I'm not the person making the decisions and if current government policy continues as it is. So what we do, as you know, budget to budget and manifesto to manifesto, is we produce our plans, our figures and our proposals within the financial parameters of the day. And as we prepare for government, we're in this process now, in terms of higher education, education more generally, we're reworking all of those plans. And when we go to the people next time round, we will be going as a party very clearly asking for the electorate to give us the opportunity to govern. It'll probably be the first time in real terms that Sinn Fein will present itself to the people in the south here in the 26 counties as a party with a real and live prospect of being in government and perhaps leading the government.
I think that's an opportune moment to bring in Danny McCoy, who of course represents business. And what we're hearing today is commitments in relation to funding. Danny McCoy, a number of the big fundraisers in the Sinn Fein manifesto, how we're going to pay for this type of funding, are based on increases in business tax. So what's your thinking of what you've heard so far today from Deputy McDonald, Danny?
So I think there's broad agreement on the ends here. The investment criteria of funding higher education in terms of returns to both society and to business are beyond doubt, in contrast to where other investments can be made. So there is an agreement, I think, across the board on that particular point. But closing down particular channels in terms of the means to get to those ends, I think, is where there will be some differential. On the Castle's report, that was pretty clear that it was going to be a tripartite element there. The state would increase direct funding, employers would have extra payments through the PRSI, which have come in, may not be sufficient scale for the task required, and also the use of fees. Because again, we're dealing with a society as it is right now, and the capacity of households and individuals to leverage on the skills they get from university to pay for it over their lifetime is certainly utilized in other jurisdictions. So what we have here is a philosophical argument. Are we talking about the greatest utility for the greatest number, or the egalitarian view of some kind of maxi min? And if you pivot it all around the last person in, it fails to appreciate where the universities are having to compete for Ireland and for our society internationally. So removing one of those channels for actually pricing the quality of our education and the quality of our research seems to be a pretty limited way to go, and closes down options for our society rather than to advance them. That would be my view of abolishing fees, for instance.
Do you accept that employers will have to pay more tax to fund higher level education and research?
Well, that principle was conceded with the Casel's report, and PRSI went up, and Ibec supported it, and Irish business. And and if there is more to come, and the Commission on Taxation and Welfare, I'm sure, will bring forward additional views on employer and employee PRSI as a mechanism. Why if it is more than philosophical arguments, why would you remove the capacity to charge fees to households and individuals who can afford them? What's the merit in that?
Mary Lou McDonald, why would you do that?
Because we believe in universal provision and universal access. And by the way, we're not unique in that. I think if the commitment of a society is to academic excellence, to innovation, to research, well then you create an ecosystem in which that is the reality and in which that is most possible. And notwithstanding the fact that people do pay the fees, and there are sections of our society who are very well off and who are very high income earners. We could have a whole other debate, and Danny and I have, around income tax levels and so on, the corporate tax burden and so on. Just don't miss the point that there are many families, there's a whole stratum of society who pay the fees, but who really struggle to do so. And it's one thing if you have one person in education. When you get down, if you're number 2 or number 3 or number 4 in the queue, you're really putting a huge level of stress and strain on those households. So our concern isn't for that section of society which is very, very wealthy, which is the small section of society. It's people in the middle, and you hear them, all sorts of terms are used, the squeezed middle, or, which many people wouldn't welcome being put into that particular, described in those terms. But that is a reality. I know myself, I'm in the business of people. We meet people and we hear their stories and experiences every day, Louise. And I know certainly in right across this town, there are families that will tell you, yes, we paid the fees, but by God, it's a struggle to do so. And in some cases, it can be a choice for one person in a family getting the benefit of the education and another not. So So there you have it.
So why would you,
Danny McCoy, go ahead. Danny McCoy,
so
go.
why would you defer the option then of actually student loans, or for people paying this back over their lifetimes when they've proven that their educational attainment gives them the income capacity to pay?
Well, I think, Danny, if you look at the experiences elsewhere, what you find is that students wind up starting out their lives. So we're talking about, you know, my commentary now is around school leavers who go on to university or higher education and who take out these loans. Many of them end up burdened with that loan for a very long time. And there isn't simply, sadly, a linear or an absolute certainty that you graduate, that you're very highly qualified, and you therefore enter quality, secure, and very highly paid employment. That's not the reality for many people, including graduates. I mean, it would be a myth to suggest that graduates are coming out and automatically accessing, you know, secure, well-paid employment. They are not. Some are. Some particular professions are, and lines are particularly lucrative at a point in time. But the experience now is not that. And I would be absolutely loath to burdening people coming out of education, starting out on their life's journey with levels of debt on their back. I would be absolutely loath to do that. And I would be all the more so in the current circumstances where accommodation, access to basic public services is just so tight, and particularly for younger people.
There's a lot to discuss around funding and fees, but there's another big issue, I guess, that a lot of people tuning in this lunchtime have on their minds, and that is this higher education bill. Can I go back to Professor Dochartaigh? I suppose the state will argue that if there is greater direct funding coming down the tracks, that greater oversight is needed. From your perspective, Professor, what changes need to be made to that bill?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Look, I have no issue, nor does anyone in the third level sector, with the notion of accountability. Absolutely, we have to be held accountable for any public money that we spend. And we are responsible to society, and we are of our society. I think that aspects of this bill are welcome, in that I've no issue whatsoever with the reduction in size of governing authorities, for example, that then focuses on an element of representation of the stakeholders, but also on professional skills sitting there that will help us govern and so on. I think one of the key issues is whether, in fact, well, two. First of all, I think as currently constructed, it runs the risk of appearing to put significant power in the hands of the minister over the individual universities. And whilst that may never be exercised, if that power is there even in the abstract way, I think that's unhealthy in a democratic society. And secondly, it almost in a way feels as if it's not really going to address the key issue. This isn't actually a substitute for what is really the burning issue. And I hate to go back to it again, but it is funding. I think that, there have been a small number of high publicity incidents in different universities recently around accountability and so on over the last lot of years, actually, not recently. And I don't know whether that's the motivation for this bill or what exactly it is, but I think it potentially looks like a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And really, I think fundamentally, we should not get away from the fact that universities welcome accountability, but we also need to be agile. We are also ambitious, and we need to make sure that we don't put in place structures that might leave us constantly looking over our shoulder saying, if we do X, Y, and Z, because we're meant to be fountains of creativity. We are meant to be places where people think freely, where they challenge received wisdom, where they challenge state priorities. I welcome Mary Lou's comment that this is about more than just STEM. This is about more than just science and business and so on. This is about the arts, about creativity. All of those spaces are important to us. And what we need is a framework, and I think it's enshrined fairly well in the 1997 Act, that says, let's make absolutely darn sure that we create an environment in which all of that creativity, staff and students, can unfold right across the piece. I think if we spend too much time on the governance piece, fully accepting that the accountability has to be there, then there's a danger that it actually restricts or has the potential to restrict the agility, the flexibility, the creativity that are at the core of what universities are about. So I do think we need to proceed carefully on that, and the IUA is feeding back in that regard.
What do you say to that, Deputy McDonald? Do you think those concerns that the sector has are justified?
Well, I do, Louise, but let me say this also. It is, of course, extremely important that when public monies are expended anywhere, and that includes in the area of higher education, that there is full public confidence that monies are being used for the purposes allocated and that the taxpayer is getting good value, and that there isn't sort of sloppy or inappropriate governance or lack of governance oversight or lack of oversight. And I don't think there is anybody in this conversation today who would argue for anything other than proper oversight and accountability for public monies.
So what would you do differently then?
So I think it is a case of getting the balance right, and the bill will come for pre-legislative scrutiny, and there will be feedback from the sector. And I think that needs to be listened to very carefully, because it's a question of balancing that sense of autonomy, independence of action, which is necessary to develop any institution on the one hand, and making sure still that the public purse is protected and that there is adequate oversight. I think we also have to have an eye on, and the role of the minister was mentioned there, and I'm not suggesting that this minister or any future minister would develop any kind of megalomaniac tendencies, but places of learning have to have at their core also innovation, independence of thought, that thing called academic freedom. So it's important that that is protected as well, because no institute of higher education is churning out widgets. You know, it's not a production line. It's a completely different, as you know, dynamic, and learning and thought and innovation and critique and criticism can't be trammeled in any way because you are in receipt of public money. So I think it's a case of hitting that balance. Louise, I was on the Public Accounts Committee at a time when some academic institutions were presenting and were brought through their paces in respect of procedures and so on. And very often in those individual institutions, the answer to what was wrong existed already. We're not splitting the atom here. We're not reinventing the wheel. It's a case of good internal, robust internal processes and procedure. It's a question of having people trained and aware and accountable. And then it's a case, I agree absolutely, the governance piece is important, but it is far outshadowed by the funding issue. So if we're going to get governance right, for goodness sake, we also have to take the initiative and get the funding piece right as well.
We're up against it time-wise a little bit, and there's two very quick things I'd like to touch on. Danny McCoy, if I can ask you, and we are all dying to get back into real life meetings, back on campuses, and to be doing this type of thing in real life. But Danny, from an industry perspective, how do you see the importance of getting students back to learning in person, and what can we bring from the pandemic learning into the graduates that you'd like to see?
Yeah, so I think it is critical, because a bit like many people in their careers will have reached a point where they can act as individual contributors, and technology can facilitate that. But the idea of collegiality and college and a congregation, I think, is really crucial for all of those networks and for learning culture. So I think as a prioritization, I think getting back onto campuses for our society and for the very large numbers of people involved at the stage of career really important. So, but I think the future will be quite different. I think the capacity of lifelong learning has been opened up as well by technology, and we've seen that access to information is really huge right now. The trick is to make sure it's access to knowledge, and that's where the key function of the universities and tertiary education is to make information knowledge, not just information. So I would think that a blended solution will be there for lifelong learning, but particularly for research and collaboration, and for universities as we know it, I think it should be a prioritized reconvening as quickly as possible in this September.
Okay, we'll give the last word to our keynote speaker, Deputy McDonald. You know, you've spoken about the ambitions to lead and to be part of government. Ideally, you know, there'd be a one-party government, but those days in large measure seem to be gone. So in the event of a Sinn Fein coalition with another party, Deputy McDonald, what policies of the current government would you keep? And I guess specifically, would you keep the separate Department of Higher Education and Research in a Sinn Fein government?
I think there might be merit in that. I think we need to. I mean, it's a whole handling to set up a new department and to create that infrastructure, and then to engage with the sector and set a course of action and expectations. So the bias, I suppose, would be in maintaining the department, but it's a young department. And I think we would have to evaluate for however long this government lasts, its effectiveness and its capacity, or what might be achieved through it. But really, whatever the departmental configuration, what will not change is the need to step up as regards funding. And can I also say, I think it's so important that people get back on campus come September, October. Poor freshman students. Imagine, Louise, being a first-year student and your university or college or learning experience is in your bedroom, you know, on your computer. If you're lucky enough to have a bedroom of your own that you're not sharing. I mean, it has been really, really hard. And I know it's been hard on staff, and I know people are anxious to get back, because I agree with Danny on this, that sense of collegiality and contact. And I mean, that's part and parcel of how human beings learn for themselves and from each other. So I think antigen testing and whatever else it takes to get people back safely back on campus and to keep things open has to be absolutely pursued by the current government, and in any future government. As to whether you would maintain different policies, it's probably easier to identify the things that you would ditch. But undoubtedly, let's acknowledge there are things that we do get right, and there are things that there is consensus across political life on. And I think one of the strong consensus points is that we want to get higher education right. We'll differ on the means, we'll differ on the detail, but there has to be delivery now.
Okay, well, look, we've had, I think, a really, really interesting, really insightful discussion. It's been great to hear those policies outlined and to hear them challenged by the panel. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining us, because we are against time. Mary Lou McDonald, Professor Kieran O'Hogartig, Danny McCoy, and Professor Paula Dochartaigh, thank you very much for your time today. Summer is nearly here. I can feel the people on the webinar crawling towards the summertime. It's been a really difficult year. So thank you for your time today. And it's been great to hear particularly from Deputy McDonald. But this Future of Ireland series will begin again in September after the summertime, when we'll be looking at topics such as sustainability, the role of universities in arts and culture in Ireland, and a special focus on research to tie in with the national Creating Our Future Public Engagement with Research campaign. So it's been my pleasure to be your MC today. Thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.